Humanity's first encounter with the ruins of a fallen galactic empire did not begin with spectacle, nor with war, nor with the triumphant arrival of fleets across the cosmic stage. It began with a tremor, subtle, mathematical, and impossibly deliberate, hiding inside the noise of interstellar background radiation. Astronomers later described it as a whisper coded in dying starlight, a signal so faint that only the stubbornness of human curiosity could have uncovered it. It was said that the universe itself seemed to exhale when the pattern was first identified, as though something old and heavy had finally shifted in its sleep. For years, Earth had looked outward with cautious hope. Humanity, now scattered across Luna, Mars, the orbital habitats, and the first sister planets beyond Sol, had achieved much, but everything was still small when set against the tapestry of the Milky Way. People dreamed of company among the stars, yet feared what ancient powers might still linger in the cosmic dark. Humanity's first faster-than-light jump had taken place less than a century earlier, and even that breakthrough felt miraculous, a product of fearless experimentation and relentless improvisation rather than elegant mastery. Human ingenuity often ran on defiance rather than delicacy. The whisper in the radiation, however, did not behave like anything natural. It repeated with mechanical patience, threading itself across frequencies in a cascade of structured harmonics. Its architecture was so precise that it seemed impossible that no living species had crafted it in the present era. Humanity scoured it, decoded it, and mapped it. What emerged was a star coordinate so remote and so barren-looking that most nations saw no reason to send an expedition. But human stubbornness exceeded caution once again. Someone argued that the ruins of long-dead civilizations might hold lost wonders. Someone else whispered that humanity had always been underestimated, by itself most of all. And so a multinational venture formed around a simple, dangerous ambition: to go and see. The star system catalogued as Epsilon Mirage 3 had long appeared lifeless from afar, its worlds drifting in quiet orbits around a cold subgiant. No signals had ever been registered from its direction. No anomalies had ever warranted investigation. Yet when humanity arrived with a fleet of survey ships, the truth unfolded in a scale so vast that it stunned even the most seasoned explorers. Orbiting the third planet of the system, scattered like colossal bones across the void, was a shattered megastructure, once a ring or a halo or perhaps something stranger. Its fragments carried scars of impossible age, pitted by cosmic erosion and fractured by forces beyond human understanding. Each segment was larger than Earth's largest cities. Each carried markings in a script no linguist had ever encountered. The structure did not drift randomly. Its pieces maintained an eerie geometric discipline, suspended in angles too unnatural for mere coincidence. It was as though the remains of an ancient construction still remembered the shape they once held. Humanity's senses trembled under the weight of the discovery. The megastructure emitted no power signature, yet subtle readings indicated dormant subsystems, circuits that had not fully died, though their glow had faded millennia ago. The expedition concluded unanimously that the structure was artificial, older than any human historical framework could contextualize. A silence settled over the fleet as the implications took root. Humanity had not simply found ruins. It had uncovered evidence of a civilization that once shaped the galaxy, one with ambitions so immense that even its fragments dwarfed Earth's greatest achievements. The third planet below the ruins was a scarred globe of deserts, windswept canyons, and desiccated oceans. Long craters marred its surface, not all of them natural. Humanity deployed drones, landers, and survey teams across its continents. What they found deepened the mystery. Cities, if they could still be called that, lay buried beneath the sands. Towers collapsed under their own weight. Roadways fused into ancient bedrock. Entire industrial complexes stood petrified, as if flash-frozen in time. The architecture hinted at beings tall, slender, and efficient in design, a species that had not merely survived but thrived, shaping its environment with confidence and precision. These cities were dead, but they had not died peacefully. Everywhere, explorers found signs of conflict, walls melted by directed energy, structures pierced by kinetic impacts, facilities collapsed inward as if torn by gravitational forces far beyond human weapons. Everything pointed to a civilization that had faced an enemy capable of breaching planetary defenses, shattering orbital megastructures, and extinguishing a seemingly dominant species with ruthless efficiency. Humanity felt the gravity of that truth, whatever had destroyed. This ancient empire had been terrible enough to leave no survivors, no warnings, only ruins and a whisper in cosmic radiation drifting through time. Yet the deeper humanity searched, the more the ruins responded. Seismic sensors detected faint tremors not caused by tectonic shifts. Subsurface scans revealed buried constructs, machines the size of skyscrapers, inert but intact. Vast conduits connected regions thousands of miles apart. Then humanity stumbled upon its most startling discovery, a planet-spanning network of monolithic chambers, each sealed by materials harder than any terrestrial alloy. These chambers hummed with an internal resonance, weak but measurable, as though holding the dying heartbeat of a lost giant. The lead researchers concluded that these chambers were not tombs nor vaults, they were reactors, ancient ones, reactors that had once powered planetary-scale engineering projects, perhaps even the orbital megastructure above. But not all were fully dormant. Some emitted pulses akin to distress signals. The pulses correlated with the star map whisper. At that revelation, humanity realized something monumental. The signal had been designed to guide future travelers, not merely to the ruins themselves, but specifically to the heart of the planet's sleeping machinery. It was as though the ancient architects had anticipated their downfall and encoded a desperate invitation for anyone capable enough or foolish enough to uncover their legacy. Humanity chose to press deeper. As excavation teams drilled into one of the primary reactor chambers, the planet shook. Dust, untouched for epochs, cascaded like a brown snowfall. Lights flickered in the chamber's depths, small, uncertain, like sparks relighting in a long-abandoned forge. The air vibrated with a resonance so low it felt more like emotion than sound. The excavators described the moment as standing beside a waking titan. Then the chamber's walls shifted. Massive plates unlocked with a sound like grinding thunder. For the first time in unknown millennia, the inner mechanisms of the fallen empire stirred. Humanity was not prepared. What emerged from the chamber was not a weapon, nor a creature, nor anything biological. It was knowledge, projected in waves of electromagnetic patterns, cascading through frequencies faster than human minds could process. Instruments captured only fragments, Yet even those fragments revealed data formats centuries beyond human capability. The projections mapped out star systems, wars, catastrophes, and trajectories of extinction. They depicted colossal armadas engulfed in the void. They showed the ancient civilization, once a dominant power, brought low by forces that defied physics as humanity understood it. But one message repeated more clearly than the rest, a warning disguised as a chronicle shaped as a plea. Humanity's analysts, AI cores, and supercomputers parsed what they could. The fallen empire's downfall had come not from within, but from an external enemy, a species or machine or phenomenon simply labeled in the ancient data as the Devourers. The Devourers swept through star systems like a cosmic plague, erasing civilizations with terrifying efficiency. Their attacks began with silence, proceeded with impossible distortions of energy and matter, and ended with the complete disappearance of planetary biospheres. The fallen empire had fought back. They had forged weapons and technologies beyond modern comprehension. They had built megastructures, warships, and planet-shielding reactors. They had resisted for millennia, but in the end, resistance had crumbled. Humanity, now standing amid the bones of that grand civilization, understood the implications with chilling clarity. If the whisper had awakened the ruins, and the ruins had carried warnings of extinction, then humanity had not arrived by accident. Something had wanted them here, perhaps the ruins themselves, perhaps the final automated systems of the ancient empire, perhaps something else entirely. More troubling was this: the whisper had begun to change. The once stable pattern started incorporating new elements, signals clearly responding to the presence of human technology. The structures in orbit emitted minute bursts of encoded energy timed precisely with humanity's scanners. Planetary tremors synchronized with human excavation activities. The megastructure fragments adjusted their geometric formation by infinitesimal increments, as though recalibrating or aligning for some unknown purpose. The ruins were not simply awakening, they were becoming aware. Humanity had a decision to make: retreat and abandon the discovery, or delve deeper into the ancient machinery, risking unknown consequences, but gaining priceless insight into the fate of the fallen empire. Humanity chose to descend. The deeper they ventured, the more complex the atmospheric resonance became. It carried tones that evoked dread, awe, sorrow, and something G-like determination. The chamber systems seemed to evaluate humanity, cycling through patterns that resembled tests of cognition, endurance, and adaptability, tests which humanity passed, not with elegance, but with the dogged resilience that had defined its ascent since the dawn of time. At the lowest point of the reactor network, humanity found a final vault, larger than any cathedral on Earth, its ceiling lost in a haze of dim luminescence. In its center rested a colossal core of crystalline alloy, shattered but still glowing faintly, like a dying ember refusing to extinguish. It pulsed once every few minutes, each pulse radiating mathematical symphonies encoded with cryptic significance. Surrounding the core were statues, perhaps memorials, depicting the tall, slender inhabitants of the lost civilization. They stood in silent rows, guardians of a secret they had failed to protect. Humanity feared the core at first. It felt alive, ancient, and wounded. Yet it also felt familiar in a strange way. Its rhythms echoed something deeply human, the relentless refusal to surrender. As the excavation team approached, the core released its brightest pulse yet. A tremor shook the entire planet. The megastructure in orbit realigned. Subsystems across the ruins awakened simultaneously. A cascade of radiation burst outward, echoing across the surrounding void. Human ships detected unknown energy signatures spiking across the system's outer edges, ripples that did not originate from the ruins. The whisper in the cosmic background abruptly ceased. Then something new appeared in its place. A second signal, stronger, sharper, closer. Humanity's senses trembled under its weight. It was not ancient. It was not passive. It was incoming. The ruins had not simply awakened, they had called attention. And something out there had heard. In that moment, as the ancient core pulsed with renewed urgency and the distant signal grew stronger, humanity felt a truth settle like a shadow across the stars. The devourers might not be extinct, and humanity, insignificant by cosmic standards, yet unyielding in spirit, now stood at the threshold of a conflict older than recorded history. The ruins were no longer silent. The galaxy was no longer empty. And humanity was no longer alone. The days that followed the first pulse were measured in stunned calculation and urgent improvisation. Humanity, pressed into the cold calculus of survival by a cosmos suddenly alive with legacy and threat, moved like a species waking to its own legend. Commands were not shouted, but transmitted across secure channels, yet even in silence the movement of minds was a chorus. Engineers recalibrating ancient interfaces, historians racing to map fragments of the old language, pilots tracing trajectories through the newly noisy dark. The ruins had become both a classroom and a crucible, and humanity bent to learn. The second signal's approach carved a new axis into the sky. It hammered at detectors with an impatience that erased any remaining notion that the galaxy would be a hospitable neighbor. The pattern, sharp, angular, and devoid of warmth, arrived not as a wave but as a plan, a spatial choreography, a projected path through which some force would pass and test everything in its wake. For the first time since humans had learned to push beyond the cradle of soul, the species faced an external unknown that did not merely threaten them in concept, but had a trajectory, a timetable, and an intent. Humanity responded in the only ways it knew how, with ingenuity, with audacity, and with the unflinching willingness to turn its own perceived weaknesses into strategies. Fleets that had once been showpieces of national pride were reorganized into task forces bound by a single, stubborn insistence: survival. Scientists who had spent lifetimes studying relativistic physics and exobiology poured their knowledge into weapons and shields improvised from the ruins. Pilots trained in lunar currents and asteroid slings readied vessels repurposed to dance at the very edge of catastrophe. People who had once worried about trade tariffs and orbital real estate suddenly coordinated evacuation protocols and resource triage with a clarity that would have humbled the old bureaucracies. There was no single leader. There was no polished chain of command. There was only an emergent pattern of cooperation guided by the simple arithmetic of risk and the louder, human arithmetic of hope. Humanity learned to broadcast not just telemetry but trust. Data and manpower moved faster than envy. Rivalries softened under shared threat. Old grudges cooled because the void beyond cared little for petty scores. The ruins had offered a gift, a map not only of ancient tragedies but of ancient tools. Humanity seized it. The core's strangeness proved to be both irritation and boon. Its crystalline matrix emitted frequencies that seemed to favor certain quantum states, and those states could be coaxed into forming rudimentary logic gates. Engineers used what was available: tubed relays, improvised superconductors, and centuries of human stubbornness to build interfaces that let living minds converse with the dead machine's faint intelligence. The exchange was halting. The core's memory had been corrupted, its records fragmented, yet patterns persisted: tactical doctrines, ship schematics, star charts with roots burned by war. It took weeks of sleepless work to assemble coherent sequences, but when the first usable algorithm rose from the rubble of corrupted data, it was nothing less than a revelation. Those sequences contained designs for defensive lattices, layered shields that refracted energetic assaults into harmless interference, and propulsion techniques that bent local spacetime in ways human engineers had only theorized. They included lessons in logistics on a scale that dwarfed modern militaries, supply routing for entire systems, failover architectures for planetary grids, even contingency protocols for species collapse. Most importantly, they contained a catalogue of the Devourer's signatures: how the enemy dispensed its consumptive force, how it masked itself, and crucially, the one pattern that preceded its attacks: an entropy inversion that began in the quantum vacuum around a target and propagated outward. Humanity, ragged and imperfect, took these lessons and folded them into their own improvisational genius. They adapted the shield lattices into modular arrays deployable from carrier frames. They borrowed propulsion ideas to mount short-range evasive bursts on survey vessels. They translated the Devourer's signature into alarms and early warning matrices. It was not elegant. It was human. It worked. The first practical proof of that work came in the form of a small, converted freighter designated by no proud name but by a mission: to fly ahead and see. The freighter, laden with men and women who had volunteered out of a mixture of duty and a hunger to shape history, threaded the dark between Epsilon Mirage 3 and the direction of the incoming signal. It did not possess the refined materials or noble lineage of a warship. It had been patched, welded, and blessed by prayer and profanity in equal measure. Sensors were bolstered, reactive armor added, and a lattice of the core's shield fragments hung like a necklace from its hull. In 1,000 ways it was inadequate, and in one vital way it was brave. When the freighter crossed the line where the Devourer's distortions first bent spacetime, the alarms screamed with precise, awful knowledge. The universe hiccuped. Instruments failed and then reasserted themselves with new baselines. For a breathless minute, the craft existed in a place where reality's rules were negotiable. And yet, through the broken mathematics and chaotic flux, the shield lattice held. Radiation that would have shredded modern electronics diffracted along the arrays and collapsed into harmless noise. The freighter's crew recorded a brief glimpse of a thing that was not like them: a silhouette of motion across the void, a ripple that seemed to drink in starlight and leave cold behind. The freighter returned. It returned scarred and silent, its hull pitted with geometry that did not respect Euclidean convention, but it returned. Its data, when decoded, painted a portrait of the devourers unlike anything human myth or nightmare had predicted. They were not merely predators, they were processes, heuristic algorithms of annihilation, patterns of engineered entropy designed to unmake structured complexity. They behaved like machines, like emergent functions of a system that consumed ordered arrangements and left only statistical whiteness. Their passage was surgical, efficient, and profound. The knowledge came with gravity. If the devourers were processes, they could be understood. And if they could be understood, they could be countered. Humanity's next step was both audacious and fundamentally American in its bent. It improvised a banner not as a flag of dominion, but as a signal. Bits and improvisations coalesced into a tactical solution that favored deception over confrontation. The idea was simple in concept, but devilishly complex in execution. To make humanity appear less appetizing than the ruins, to cloak human activity in artificial entropy, and thus divert or confuse the devourers' process-driven appetites. It was, in essence, a cunning camouflage of information and energy. The scheme required a grid of electromagnetic noise generators distributed across Epsilon Mirach 3 orbit and surface, calibrated to mimic the statistical signatures of catastrophic collapse. The plan demanded expendables, drones and decay structures that would broadcast false indicators of instability. It required crews to ride into the teeth of the devourers, approach and paint lies across the sky. It required sacrifice and a certain national flavor of audacity that did not wait for perfectio. Then, before acting, engineers took the core's fragments and retooled their emissions into noise generators. They fed the devourer's signature into feedback loops designed to confuse the enemy's pattern-matching heuristics. Scientists developed synthetic decay fields that imitated the end states of civilizations destroyed by the devourers. Dozens of volunteers, scientists, pilots, technicians, manned the arrays, each one aware that their devices might attract the very force they hoped to mislead. Then the second signal arrived in earnest. It entered the system like a blade of pallid light, and the darkness around it seemed to thicken. Instruments registered distortions that laughed at calibration charts. The synthetic decay fields fired, casting false readings into the void. The decays flared like pyres, and the noise generators spat data designed to mislead. For a moment, eternity might have been fooled. The devourer's passage slowed, its process hesitating as it ran a new evaluation. But the devourers were not simple. They adjusted, they adapted. What had begun as a single, sharp signal now unfurled into a lattice of probes, thin, needle-like constructs that seeded the vicinity with miniature entropy engines. Those probes sought out the loudest sources of order and converged on them. The decays became bait. One by one, the probes found the synthetic hotspots and collapsed them with cold precision, as if sampling a catalogue. The decays died spectacularly, and in their deaths they gleaned the characteristics of the deception. It was then that an unexpected advantage asserted itself, humanity's unpredictability. Where the ancient empire had used monolithic, centralized defenses, humanity was a swarm of small, adaptive ecosystems. When the probes learned to defeat one type of deception, humans improvised another. Algorithms were rewritten mid-flight. Drones cut new patterns of noise in the air. Pilots performed evasive dances that no machine routine could anticipate. The devourers' probes adjusted, and the improvisational countermeasures adjusted in turn. The battle became less about brute force and more about rhythm, about who could vary their steps more inventively. The ruins in orbit lent what they could. Automated turrets awakened with groaning reluctance, firing arcs of raw kinetic flares that disrupted probe trajectories. Old data caches supplied formulae for swarms, patterns of small craft flying in coordinated entropic spirals that overwhelmed probe processors through sheer combinatorial complexity. It was not the elegant victory taught in stories of ancient masters. It was a messy, human thing, 1,000 small unpredictabilities combining into a force the Devourers had not accounted for. Reports from the field were both harrowing and exultant. Small modules survived impacts that should have been fatal because crews had ripped out non-essential lines and rerouted power through archaic pathways, bypassing the Devourers' attempt to collapse systems by targeting modern dependencies. A conv escaped by launching ballast canisters to alter mass distributions and thus confuse inertial sensors. Shipwrights aboard orbital yards rewired engines to perform brief, non-intuitive vector shifts that sent probes spiraling into meaningless trajectories. Each success was hard-won and paid for in blood and metal and sleepless eyes. Amid the tactical improvisation, an emergent doctrine of leadership consolidated, the idea that humanity's greatest weapon was not its ability to match the Devourers in scale, but its capacity to surprise. The ruins had given knowledge. The freighter had given proof. The banner of noise had bought time. What remained was to turn fragmentation into advantage, to make unpredictability itself into a weapon. Command nodes optimized for rapid decentralization were established across ships and habitats, each node empowered to make decisions in moments that required reaction rather than deliberation. The chain of command bent and flexed like a reed. Strategists began to plan beyond defense. They imagined counteroffensives that were not merely direct assaults, but operations to manipulate the Devourer's process. They theorized about feeding decay patterns so elaborate they would trap parts of the enemy in self-referential loops, consuming their own probes. They imagined lures crafted not from metal and fire, but from information, virtual empires erected across the dark, glittering with the promise of order, and then allowed to decay in precisely calculated sequences that would distract and bind the Devourers. Such plans required time, and time was the currency humanity needed most. The banner bought some. The improvisations bought more. Sacrifices bought still more. Humanity priced each life against the hope that the species might survive to learn, adapt, and perhaps, in time, to strike back. And in the hush between maneuvers, as crews patched hulls and recalculated probabilities, the ruins whispered S. Argestions, the crystalline core, waking with a patience that had outlived cities, offered constraints and insights, and occasionally a grim statistic about the old empire's failures. Those grim statistics became lessons not just in technology, but in humility. The ancient masters had tried to stop the Devourers with weapons and walls. They had failed because they had sought permanence in an ephemeral universe. Humanity, by contrast, learned to move like weather, temporary, adaptive, and relentless. The second signal, encountering the human noise banner and the improvised lattice of countermeasures, did not simply withdraw. It adapted and refined in ways that made clear the contest was no simple skirmish. The probes, once neutralized by chaotic countermeasures, began to incorporate human tactics into their own logic, attempting mimicry and decoy detection with increasing sophistication. What had started as a test had grown into an interrogation, and both sides were learning. In the first true battle that followed, entire swarms danced across the black like a storm given form. There were losses that would later be commemorated as indispensable tragedies, habitats that were crippled, crews that would be remembered in inscriptions and in the way survivors tightened their ranks. There were triumphs that felt less like conquest than like stubborn survival. A ragtag flotilla slipping through a probe net because its pilots had learned to think like the enemy, to anticipate the patterns the probes would predict, and to double bluff. When the dust settled, the tally was not simple. The Devourers had not been destroyed. The ruins had not fully restored themselves. But humanity, battered and raw, had proven an essential point. It could endure the Devourers' passage, and more importantly, it could force the Devourers to pay for every scrap of ordered space it consumed. That price, once astronomical, had become negotiable. And through it all, an awakening of a different order took hold, a psychological shift that would prove as consequential as any technical innovation. Humanity had stood up to a cosmic process that had felled an empire older than myths and had not crumbled. The species had discovered that its greatest asset was not the strength of its shields or the sophistication of its contrivances, but a cultural currency forged through epochs of hardship, the refusal to accept extinction without resistance. That refusal stitched disparate peoples together with threads far sturdier than treaty ink. At the conclusion of that terrible, tentative victory, as crews repaired and as the ruins hummed with the slow, stubborn logic of an old friend learning new verbs, a new problem emerged. The Devourers were not simply predators, they were also students. They catalogued patterns and developed counters. Humanity needed to move beyond reaction and into invention. The ruins offered corridors of possibility, but the path forward required a synthesis. Ancient knowledge married to human improvisation, an alliance of memory and madness. So humanity set its sights beyond mere survival. It planned to teach the Devourers a new lesson, that predators who consumed without discernment could be lured and trapped, that processes could be gamed, that unpredictability could be calibrated into patterns so rich they would entangle an analyzer. The species resolved to turn the Devourers' methodology against them, not through emulation, but through the singular human strategy that generations had honed, making meaning where none existed, inventing stories to mislead a logic-bound enemy, and using the ruins' ancient machinery as the stage upon which to perform the most audacious, improvisational theater in cosmic history. The banner had been raised. The first victory had been bought with error, courage, and grit. Humanity, shaken but alive, began to prepare not just for the next wave, but for a long campaign, one that would test every facet of what being human truly meant. Humanity's first true battle with the Devourers reshaped not only its tactics, but its identity. The confrontation had stripped away illusions of cosmic insignificance. It had exposed a truth long buried under the centuries of human conflict, ambition, and doubt, that the species was capable of adapting faster than forces designed for annihilation. It had shown that unpredictability, once seen as humanity's flaw, could be channeled into its greatest strength. In the aftermath, While ships drifted through repair orbits and habitats patched their torn plating, humanity's leaders, engineers, and scholars converged upon a new consensus. Survival was no longer enough. To endure, humanity had to innovate beyond the constraints of inherited knowledge. It had to understand not only the devourers, but the long-dead architects who had faced them before. And it had to learn without mimicking the rigidity that had doomed the ancient empire. The ruins offered an answer, but the answer came in layers buried in labyrinths carved deep within Epsilon Mirach 3 crust. These labyrinths, once overlooked as simple service corridors, proved to be the backbone of a planetary meganetwork, a system of interconnected chambers, libraries, and manufacturing nodes designed not for the living, but for memory itself. It was a world built to teach. Explorers descended through shafts lit by the flickering violet pulses of the crystalline core. They passed into regions untouched since the fall, where dust drifted like ash from a dying hearth and walls shimmered with inscriptions that seemed almost to breathe. The ancient empire had engraved knowledge into materials that changed hue with electromagnetic fields, allowing their entire history to be read as shifting waves of color. But humanity, unable to interpret the script directly, leaned on its AI constructs, hybrid systems now enhanced with fragments stolen from the core's computational residue. Piece by piece, the labyrinth unfurled its story. The ancient empire had not always been mighty. It had risen through desperation, unified by the first appearance of the devourers in a distant age. Its people, tall and elegant in design, were methodical. Their philosophy held that order was the natural state of civilization, and that chaos was a flaw to be eliminated. They built structures of symmetry, systems of perfect logic, and shields of exacting precision. And with these tools, they had flourished for millennia. But order had betrayed them. The devourers consumed it. Predictability had made the ancient empire legible to the enemy, and that legibility had been fatal. Every strategy, no matter how advanced, had been countered. Every fortress, no matter how mighty, had been broken. In their final struggle, the ancients had sealed away their knowledge in the labyrinth, not as a beacon, but as a warning to whatever species might arise after them. Humanity read the warning differently. What the ancients had feared, chaos, imperfection, adaptation, were precisely the traits humanity wielded naturally. The ruins were a tomb for one species, but a crucible for another. Humanity did not attempt to resurrect the ancient strategies. Instead, it learned the weaknesses in those strategies and built its own in the gaps left behind. The first major breakthrough came from the labyrinth's constructory chambers, automated workshops that still held dormant machinery capable of replicating complex materials on a molecular scale. The machines, reawakened with calculated bursts of power from the crystalline core, began generating alloys that possessed both rigidity and adaptive resonance. These alloys, when struck by energy, did not crack or melt. They shifted molecular alignment to disperse the impact. Engineers quickly realized the material could be used not merely as armor, but as dynamic reinforcement for field generators. The first experimental shield built using the new alloy did not block devourer pattern signatures, it danced with them. Instead of resisting entropy collapse, it distorted the collapse into spiraling trajectories, creating pockets of stable reality that moved around a ship like drifting bubbles. It was something the ancient empire had never conceived, defense not through perfection, but through controlled imperfection. The second breakthrough emerged from the labyrinth's archives of stellar charts. The ancient empire had mapped regions of the galaxy where the Devourer's presence had been strongest and where they had encountered the most resistance. These maps were riddled with anomalies, zones where the Devourer's patterns distorted or hesitated, where their entropy engines flickered with inefficiency. Analysts pored over the data and uncovered a startling discovery. These anomalies were located around regions of astrophysical irregularity, nebulae heavy with iron storms, star clusters with chaotic gravitational eddies, and dense asteroid belts with unpredictable interference patterns. Humanity realized something profound. The Devourers, for all their vast power, were fundamentally vulnerable to environments where predictability faltered. Anything that introduced randomness at scale, cosmic storms, gravitational turbulence, debris fields, forced their processes to adapt at a cost. They consumed order but struggled within chaos. Humanity began to strategize in earnest. Fleet Command formed new unit types, chaos corridors, formations of ships that would intentionally distort local spacetime with noise bursts, particle scatterings, and artificially induced gravitational microlensing. The goal was not destruction, but misdirection, to lure the Devourers into arenas where their algorithms would struggle to compute efficient paths. As these innovations developed, another truth emerged from the labyrinth's deeper layers. The ancient empire had attempted to weaponize chaos, but had failed because their understanding of unpredictability was mathematical, not psychology. Chaos for humans was not a tool but a cultural trait, embedded in instinct, creativity, and the willingness to break patterns intentionally. The third breakthrough came from humanity's own cultural archives. Anthropologists cross-referenced ancient human warfare strategies, guerrilla tactics, misinformation campaigns, battlefield feints, with the Devourers' predictable reactions. Algorithms were written to generate battle plans based on subverting expectations. Pilots trained not just in maneuvers, but in creating narratives on the battlefield, manufacturing apparent weaknesses, performing believable retreats, crafting illusions of vulnerability. Humanity weaponized its own storytelling. The ruins responded. With each human innovation, the crystalline core pulsed brighter. Its memory systems adapted to human presence, altering its projections to better interface with the species that had succeeded where the ancients had faltered. Experts speculated that the core was not a mere archive, but an evolving intelligence, one that had waited millennia for a species capable of using its knowledge correctly. But as the core awakened, it began emitting new data. These transmissions were not warnings nor tactical logs. They were projections of the Devourer's origin, a mystery even the ancients had failed to decode. The projections displayed impossible singularities, fractal geometries collapsing into themselves, and waveforms that resembled corrupted code. The Devourers, according to the core, were not a species nor a machine. They were an emergent phenomenon birthed from a catastrophic failure in cosmic computation, an event that occurred when the universe was young and fluid. This revelation shattered old assumptions. The Devourers were not conquerors. They were the universe's own mistake, a self-propagating algorithm designed to erase complexity whenever it exceeded a cosmic threshold. A failsafe run amok. Humanity's mission expanded. This was no longer merely a war for survival, but a struggle to rewrite the universe's ancient rewrite function. Armed with new purpose, humanity entered the next phase of preparation. Prototypes rolled out from hybrid human-ancient manufactories. Ships emerged with hulls that shimmered in chaotic resonance. Drones launched with the express purpose of drawing entropy beams into false trajectories. Entire battle doctrines were rewritten around unpredictability, deception, and creative defiance. Yet even as humanity climbed toward readiness, the next threat loomed. The third Devourer signal arrived, different from the first two. It carried a heavier gravitational footprint, and its entropy signature rippled with coherent intent. Humanity's analysts identified this pattern as a prime node, one of the central processing engines of the Devourer phenomenon. Unlike the probe signals, this one did not scout or map. It judged. And it judged humanity significant. The prime node approached Epsilon Mirach with methodical certainty, distorting the void with energy curves that bent local spacetime into spirals. Planetary sensors shuddered beneath the signal's weight. The ruins, dormant systems, long silent, began activating in cascading waves, as though fearing annihilation all over again. In the face of this coming storm, humanity executed its boldest plan yet. Across the shattered remains of the orbital megastructure, engineers deployed the Chaos Network, an interconnected grid of improvised emitters crafted from both ancient components and human scavenging. These emitters were synchronized to the pulse of the crystalline core, forming a defensive tapestry that resembled a celestial storm. The strategy was unprecedented. Instead of bracing for impact, humanity intended to lure the prime node into a labyrinth of distorted space, a battlefield shaped by unpredictability. The arrival was catastrophic. Space convulsed as the prime node descended into the system, its presence collapsing the vacuum into hyperentropy channels that rippled like invisible shockwaves. Every vessel in orbit trembled. Every sensor screamed with overload. The ruins trembled as if reliving their nightmare. Then the Chaos Network activated. The megastructure fragments flickered with erratic energy. The sky ignited with spirals of gravitational interference. Lattices of radiant storms unfolded like blooming flowers of distortion. The prime node's entropy beams, once precise and surgical, now fractured into chaotic prisms. Humanity seized its moment. Ships dove into the chaos with a grace born not of perfection, but of instinct. Pilots used the storms as cover, weaving through patterns no machine could calculate. Drones deployed waves of misinformation pulses that proliferated through the battlefield like swarms of digital phantoms. The Devourer node responded with brute force, unleashing torrents of energy that twisted reality, but the chaotic environment diluted its efficiency. Its algorithms strained. For the first time in recorded history, a Devourer prime node hesitated. Humanity exploited the hesitation with the most human tactic of all: escalation through improvisation. A scout ship deliberately faked a reactor implosion, drawing entropy beams toward a false gravitational signature. A carrier executed an improbable, risk-laden slingshot maneuver that redirected its field projectors into the prime node's blind zone. Engineers aboard orbital platforms rigged unstable power cores to detonate in patterns that mimicked collapsing star fragments. Each action defied logic. Each action rewrote expectation. And together they wove a trap. As the prime node recalibrated, the crystalline core pulsed one final time, releasing a pattern of energy that merged with the chaos network. The pulse triggered a field inversion, a controlled collapse that bent entropy inward. The inversion wrapped around the prime node, locking it inside a cocoon of its own unmaking. The devourer entity convulsed. The stars dimmed around it. Then, for the first time since the dawn of galactic history, a devourer prime node died. Humanity stood triumphant but trembling. For the death cry of the node traveled across the void like a beacon. A beacon that would not go unheard. The death of the prime node sent shockwaves far beyond the battlefield. Though no sound traveled in the vacuum of space, the event reverberated across the very fabric of cosmic computation. It was a disruption unlike anything recorded in the ancient archives, a deviation from a process that had run uninterrupted for eons. The devourers, those vast engines of entropy, had experienced a failure state. And for entities built on the absolutes of efficiency and inevitability, such failure was intolerable. Humanity had done more than simply win a battle. It had introduced anomaly into a system that recognized almost nothing else. Across distant regions of the galaxy, where devourer processes consumed dying stars and stripped barren worlds into raw data, a pulse of recalibration whispered through their networks. Something unpredictable had resisted them. Something defiant had broken their pattern. And so, as the broken prime node dissolved into fractal dust, the universe shifted in its seat, as though realizing that humanity had entered the stage not as spectators, but as participants in an ancient cosmic struggle. Yet victory did not feel like triumph. The battlefield around Epsilon Mirach lay scarred. Wreckage drifted like metallic asteroids. Chaotic storms still curled through the void, remnants of humanity's engineered distortions. The orbital megastructure fragments glowed with the fading aftermath of the energy inversion. And though the prime node had been destroyed, its passing carved deep wounds into the system's fabric, gravitational ripples that distorted planetary tides and electromagnetic fields alike. The humans who survived felt the weight of these changes. Every ship carried the scars of a battle that should not have been winnable. Every habitat bore the memory of twisted space and entropy storms. Every engineer, pilot, and scientist understood that humanity had been thrust into a war it had never intended to join. But humanity also felt something else, something fierce and galvanizing. It felt the hum of hope. If a prime node could be defeated, then the devourers were not invincible. If the universe had once tolerated only inevitable consumption, then humanity had introduced an alternative, resistance through ingenuity, courage, and defiant complexity. And if the ancients had died believing no one could break the cycle, then humanity stood ready to rewrite that ancient assumption. In the aftermath of battle, attention turned immediately to preparation. The crystalline core, now glowing with a steady intensity, continued to process its awakening. The inversion field that had trapped the prime node had also triggered subsystems deep within the labyrinth. Chambers once dormant now pulsed with life. Hallways lit with streams of data. Forgotten machines hummed as though relieved to witness a possibility they had long abandoned. Humanity entered these newly awakened regions with reverence and caution. What they discovered there would reshape their next steps. The first of the new chamber networks revealed advanced construction facilities, vast halls filled with skeletal frameworks of machines that had once built fleets. Their arms, joints, and conduits had been designed for beings much taller and more slender than humans, yet the machinery responded eagerly to human activation. It adapted to the new users, reshaping its controls and interfaces. It seemed almost eager to continue its old purpose, to forge instruments capable of standing against the devourers. The second new chamber yielded something stranger, repositories of probability schematics, calculations that mapped possible responses to devourer incursions across millions of scenarios. These schematics were not blueprints, but strategies encoded in mathematics and potential outcomes. The ancient empire had attempted to predict the future of its war. Humanity, examining these models, discovered something startling. In every scenario where unpredictability increased beyond a threshold, the devourer's victory became less efficient. The ancients had been too rigid to exploit this. Humanity would not make the same mistake. The third new chamber housed something no one expected, a device unlike anything seen in either human or ancient records. Its architecture resembled a sphere of interlocking plates, each covered in glyphs that shimmered like frozen water. It was connected to a deep network of conduits that pulsed in time with the crystalline core. Humanity quickly realized that the device was not a weapon, but a navigator designed to chart safe passage through chaotic space-time distortions. The ancient empire had created it to escape the devourers, but had never completed their plan. Humanity, driven by audacity, would finish it. As weeks passed, the navigator sphere awakened. Its plates unfolded like petals, revealing a map of the galaxy not as a static image, but as a shifting, luminous lattice of probability currents. It displayed routes through nebulae, star clusters, and gravitational eddies, hidden pathways where devourer efficiency dropped drastically. It showed corridors of chaos that humanity could exploit. But the sphere also revealed something else. A region of darkness. A void not caused by absence, but by saturation. A place where devourer processes coalesced into something vast and terrible. This was their origin point, where the entropy algorithm had first awakened and begun devouring the galaxy. Humanity soon realized a terrible truth. The death of the prime node had drawn the gaze of whatever resided there. Signals emanated from the dark region, dense, multi-layered patterns that broke human senses and strained ancient systems. The devourers were not merely reacting, they were mobilizing. Humanity now had limited time to prepare. It began with ships. From the awakened constructories emerged the first vessels of a new human-ancient hybrid fleet. Their hulls shimmered with adaptive resonance alloys. Their propulsion cores utilized micro-distortion bursts that allowed evasive trajectories previously impossible. Their shields were no longer static domes, but swirling fractal fields that danced with incoming attacks. Stratified chaos, deliberately engineered. These new vessels were not battle cruisers. They were predators of unpredictability, designed to thrive where logic faltered. Next came the network defense system. The chaos network that had encircled the megastructure was refined into an interplanetary mesh of distributed field generators. Instead of relying on centralized power, each node drew from localized fluctuations, making the entire system harder to track and disable. Human scientists wove ancient probability algorithms into these nodes, turning the network into a sentient defensive tapestry. Then came the psychological shift. Humanity began to think in new ways. Old military strategies were rewritten around improvisational logic. Crews trained to operate in environments where physics could twist without warning. Pilots learned to navigate through distortion eddies by instinct as much as by instrument. Officers were encouraged to challenge their own plans, to question assumptions, to anticipate the unexpected, not as a flaw, but as a necessity. Humans became students not only of the ancient empire, but of chaos itself. And with each adaptation, the ruins pulsed brighter. The crystalline core's resonance grew stronger. The megastructure fragments began slowly, steadily reorienting, as though forming a pattern humanity had not yet recognized. But just as unity solidified across human colonies and alliances, tension emerged. A schism grew between factions who believed humanity must seek out the devourer origin and confront it directly, and those who argued that humanity should fortify Epsilon Mirach as a stronghold, drawing the enemy into terrain that favored human unpredictability. Both sides had merit, and both carried risk. Direct confrontation could cut the war off at its source, but could just as easily doom humanity to annihilation. Fortification could buy time, but time was the one resource the devourers could eventually overwhelm. Yet it was not politics that broke the impasse, it was the labyrinth itself. For deep within the final chamber, the crystalline core projected a fragment of ancient memory, a scene etched into recorded energy. It depicted the last days of the ancient empire, their fleets massed, their worlds fortified, their greatest minds united, their weapons gleamed with power incomprehensible. And still, despite everything, they fell. Because they waited. Because they defended. Because they hoped the devourers would react on a timeline they could PR. Edict. Humanity viewed the memory with cold silence. The message needed no translation. The ancient empire had died standing still. Humanity would not make the same mistake. A decision crystallized across human leadership, not through a single command, but through collective realization. They would not wait for the next wave. They would go to the devourer's threshold, armed with chaos, innovation, and an understanding of unpredictability the ancients never possessed. The navigator sphere, awakened fully now, began to calculate the path. Its plates folded and unfolded in intricate patterns as it charted a course through the galaxy's most chaotic regions. The route was treacherous. It passed through turbulent nebulae, unstable star clusters, and gravitational knots that bent space like molten glass. But it led directly toward the devourer origin. This would become humanity's greatest gamble. A fleet formed, small but potent, a spearhead of vessels designed to travel the labyrinthine path. They would not engage the devourers in open battle. They would infiltrate, misdirect, distort, and destabilize. They would bring unpredictability into the heart of a system built on inevitability. As preparations reached their climax, the crystalline core emitted one final revelation, a fragment of data that the ancients had not been able to decipher. It was a blueprint for something massive, something that would require material from the megastructure fragments, something that could warp space on a scale humanity had never imagined, something that could project chaos across entire star systems. A superstructure, not a weapon, but a catalyst, a device designed to permanently disrupt the Devourer's ability to calculate. The ancients had built the foundation, but had fallen before they could complete it. Humanity would finish it. The megastructure fragments began to move again, slowly rotating into new configurations. Energy flowed through the lattice of ancient circuits. Human engineers worked tirelessly to interface with systems older than human civilization itself. As all this unfolded, the first signs of the next Devourer wave appeared at the edge of the system. Space distorted, gravitational fields trembled, signals of vast complexity rippled through the void. The enemy was coming. Humanity stood ready, not as a frightened species cowering beneath stars, but as pioneers of a new cosmic paradigm. They had killed a prime node. They had awakened ancient systems. They had learned to weaponize unpredictability. But above all, humanity had discovered what the ancient empire had never understood. Complexity was not weakness. Chaos was not decay. And unpredictability was not disorder. It was freedom. And now, armed with that revelation, humanity prepared to strike into the very heart of the cosmic mistake that had haunted the galaxy for eons. Humanity stood on the edge of a precipice older than its recorded history. The Devourer's next wave gathered at the rim of Epsilon Mirach like a storm of collapsing probabilities, warping space with their terrible intent. Yet for the first time in galactic memory, a species faced them with something the ancient empire had never possessed. Not hope, not superior technology, but the audacity to rewrite the rules themselves. Around the shattered remains of the megastructure, human and ancient systems hummed with unified purpose. The crystalline core pulsed with steady brilliance, its glow synchronizing with every node in the chaos network. The once fragmented halo of the fallen empire began to rotate into precise, yet deliberately irregular patterns, geometry sculpted with human unpredictability, forming the skeleton of a superstructure that exceeded anything humanity had ever conceived. The ancients had built the foundation. Humanity would complete it. Below, on the windswept deserts of Epsilon Mirach 3, the labyrinth vibrated with awakening frequencies. The final chamber, once shrouded in silence, now hummed with harmonious resonance. Streams of data erupted in luminous cascades along walls etched by extinct hands. The memories of the fallen empire had been rekindled by the species they never knew, and in this convergence, a new chapter in galactic history sharpened into focus. The fleet chosen to traverse the Navigator Sphere's route gathered beyond the megastructure, engines shimmering with fractal resonance. These vessels were not juggernauts of overwhelming force. They were instruments of disruption, blades forged from ingenuity and chaos. Their crews had trained to navigate starfields where logic bent like soft metal, and their hulls hummed with the adaptive alloys born from ancient manufactories. At the core of the fleet hovered the navigator sphere, now fully awakened. Its interlocking plates rotated in hypnotic, fluid motion, rendering a living map of the galaxy's hidden turbulence. Pathways flickered through the void, routes carved not by starlight, but by probability. Currents, the sphere showed the way not toward victory, but toward possibility itself. The mission was simple in statement, impossible in execution. Infiltrate the heart of the Devourer's origin and activate the superstructure's final sequence, one that would spread unpredictable resonance into every layer of space touched by Devourer algorithms. In essence, humanity intended not to destroy the Devourers, but to break their certainty, to introduce chaos into a system that could not survive without perfection, to give the universe back its right to evolve. As the infiltration fleet prepared for departure, humanity's main defense forces braced for the inevitable onslaught. The Devourers' wave approached with ruthless geometry, tens of thousands of entropy nodes weaving together into a lattice of consumption, each one a mathematical guarantee of annihilation. Their presence bent the starlight into spirals, distorted inertial frames, and twisted the fabric of space-time like a tightening noose. The Chaos Network responded instantly. Its distributed nodes flickered to life, generating storms of probability distortion that splashed across the void. Space churned with erratic interference, fields of swirling energy that disrupted Devourer calculations. The enemy probes entering the system hesitated, their patterns fracturing as they recalibrated around human-induced unpredictability. The battlefield churned into a theater of contradictions. Entropy beams scattered into spirals as adaptive shields danced with impact. Human drones darted between probability pockets like sparks from a forge, each maneuver improvised, each trajectory unpredictable. Carriers hurled waves of misinformation pulses that created phantom fleets, phantom worlds, phantom vulnerabilities. The Devourers responded with cold, flawless determination, reweaving their lattice to collapse these illusions, dissecting every anomaly with relentless computation. Yet every moment spent adapting cost them opportunity, and every opportunity lost bought the infiltration fleet precious seconds. Then, with a brilliance that lit the battlefield like a second dawn, the navigator sphere activated its pathway. Reality folded into shimmering tunnels. The infiltration fleet dove into the distortion corridor, vanishing from Epsilon Mirach in a whisper of warped starlight. They were gone, headed into the galaxy's dark heart. The defenders remained behind, bracing for the storm. As the infiltration fleet traversed the corridor, they passed through nebulae raging with iron tempests, star clusters tangled in unpredictable gravity, and empty voids where light itself seemed uncertain. The navigator sphere carved their path, turning impossibility into direction. For hours, days, perhaps longer, the fleet danced through the galaxy's most violent landscapes. At last, the corridor ended. The infiltration fleet emerged into a place that defied all concept of normal space. The origin of the Devourers. A region shrouded not in darkness, but in blinding order, starlight arranged into rigid patterns, gravitational fields aligned into unnatural symmetry, nebulae frozen into perfect geometry. It was a cosmic era crystallized into form. At its center lay the primary devourer construct, a titanic lattice of entropy engines connected by beams of pure mathematical precision. It pulsed like a heart beating at the rhythm of inevitability, consuming anything that deviated from its logic. This was the birthplace of the Devourers, a self-sustaining algorithm made manifest, a flaw encoded into the early universe's computation. The infiltration fleet held its breath, or would have, if breath could be held in vacuum. Every human aboard felt the weight of the place. It was wrong, it was terrifying, and it was beautiful in its cold consistency. The Devourer origin detected them. An entropy wave surged across the void, warping probability itself. Ships buckled, shields flared. The navigator sphere screamed with interference. The fleet plunged into chaotic maneuvers, evading beams that pierced through dimensions like spears of pure negation. Every action required instinct beyond logic. Every survival depended on creativity and courage. Every ship improvised in ways no ancient empire ever could. The infiltrators pressed deeper toward the central lattice. They had not come to destroy it, they could not. Its scale was beyond weaponry, yet its perfection was its weakness. The fleet deployed the resonance modules, devices built from ancient blueprints and human imagination. They synchronized with the navigator sphere, forming a fractal pattern that vibrated with harmonic instability. Then humanity unleashed chaos. The resonance cascade rippled across the Devourer lattice, infecting its symmetry with unpredictable variance. Beams of entropy bent into spirals, algorithms faltered, nodes drifted off synchrony. The entire structure trembled as the flaw it had never accounted for, creative unpredictability, began unraveling its foundation. The central engine reacted with absolute fury. It unleashed a field of entropic collapse that engulfed the infiltration fleet, shredding space around them. Ships disintegrated into probabilities. Drones evaporated into mathematical noise. Captains, pilots, engineers, human souls bound together by purpose, held their ground even as the universe around them tried to unmake itself. It was in these final, desperate seconds that the navigator sphere revealed its last secret. The sphere had not been built merely to guide ships. It was a seed, a fragment of the ancient empire's final dream, not of escape, but of renewal. The sphere activated its own core, merging with the resonance cascade and releasing a pulse that transcended space-time, a burst of chaos that echoed across the entire Devourer network. In that moment, the infiltration fleet ceased to exist. But their sacrifice reshaped the galaxy. Back at Epsilon Mirach, the Devourer wave convulsed. Nodes flickered, beams stuttered, and the perfect geometry of their advance fractured. The Chaos Network seized the opportunity, amplifying the disruption. Entropy engines misfired. Probes lost cohesion. Massive Devourer constructs collapsed under the weight of newfound unpredictability. For the first time in their ancient existence, the Devourers hesitated. Then they broke. Not fully, not permanently, but the flaw was seeded. The resonance born from the combined brilliance of the ancient empire and the wild ingenuity of humanity had infected the Devourers with uncertainty. Their processes would never again run flawlessly. They could no longer predict every outcome, no longer guarantee annihilation. The cosmic mistake had been rewritten. Epsilon Mirach erupted in victory, not in cheers, for sound had no place in the void, but in the triumph of still-burning engines and still-standing ships. The megastructure superstructure, empowered by the crystalline core's final awakening, stabilized its chaotic resonance field, creating a permanent shield around the system. A sanctuary of unpredictability the Devourers could not penetrate. Humanity had not destroyed the Devourers. Humanity had evolved beyond them. In the aftermath, across the recovering habitats and ships, a new understanding settled over human civilization. They were no longer a young species fumbling through the stars. They were inheritors of the ancient empire's knowledge, stewards of chaos, sculptors of possibility. They were the first species to challenge inevitability and win. Historians would one day mark this as the beginning of humanity's ascent, not to dominance, but to purpose. Explorers would chart the hidden corridors mapped by the navigator's sphere. Engineers would refine the superstructure into a beacon of complexity. Philosophers would meditate on the profound truth learned in battle, that imperfection was not a flaw, but a freedom. The Devourers still existed, but no longer as an unstoppable cataclysm. Now they were merely another challenge in a galaxy filled with unknown wonders. Humanity stood on a new horizon, not as prey, not as conquerors, but as pioneers of a cosmic truth. Where order demanded surrender, humanity chose defiance. Where inevitability demanded silence, humanity answered with creation. And where the universe wrote a mistake into its earliest code, humanity rewrote the script. Thus ended the era of the first fallen galactic empire. Thus began the dawn of humanity's rise.